There's a story in Mark chapter 10. It's a story that I've, for the last month or so, I've found to be like fascinating and frustrating all at the same time, which is kind of typical of God at times. But it's a story, like I said, it's found in Mark chapter 10, and Jesus is leaving Jericho, we're told. Now, Jericho in Jesus' day was kind of a resort town, so to speak. It was a place where the middle and upper class went to get away from Jerusalem. He actually went down the hill to to Jericho. And as Jesus is leaving Jericho, we're told that as he's leaving, there's this guy, Bartimaeus is his name, and he's standing on the side of the street, or perhaps sitting, I'm not certain. And there's no windshields in this day, there are no cars, there's no radios, there's no stereos, there's no cell phones, and so because of that, and there's also no cardboard and no Sharpie pens, and so instead of writing a sign and trying to catch you as you pull out of Walmart, this guy is just screaming as people walk by. So the disenfranchised, the people on the margins of society, they just place themselves on the side of the street, and he's just screaming at the top of his lungs, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And the people around Bartimaeus are saying, like, "Shut up, be quiet, leave him alone, he's too important for you." And there's this crowd of people, Jesus making his way out of Jericho. And eventually, Jesus says, "Hey guys, bring him to me, bring him." And the guys around Bartimaeus are like, "Dude, he heard you, like he's calling you." And so they bring Bartimaeus to him, and he looks at Bartimaeus and he says, very succinctly, what do you want me to do for you?" And Bartimaeus says, "I want to see." He's a guy that's been blind, presumably, since birth. And Jesus says, "Go, your faith has healed you." And immediately, we're told, his sight was restored, and we're told that he started following Jesus, though we don't know precisely for how long. It's a fascinating story because it's a glimpse of a God who is all-powerful and who, in the blink of an eye, can do the miraculous. I find it frustrating, though, because it raises the question of, okay, God, like, if you can do the miraculous, if you can bring transformation that rapidly, that instantly, then why don't you move more rapidly in me? You know? Like, I'm working my way through Mark right now, or was a few weeks ago, in the message, and read that, and just like, Lord, like, this is amazing, this is awesome, this is like why we love you, because you can do the impossible like that. And yet it's frustrating. Because do you have any idea how much turmoil you could save me if you could change my character that quickly? Do you have any idea how much turmoil you could save those that I love and those that I live life with and the people of Narrate or whatever? If you could transform me that quickly, do you know how much trouble you could save me and a lot of people from? I mean, it's like another instance is Jesus is on the boat, and he's on this large lake, a lot like Canyon Ferry, I suppose, a little bit smaller than Canyon Ferry, and much like Canyon Ferry, if I ever have a boat, I'm not from Helena, and if I ever have a boat, it's never going on Canyon Ferry. Because what I've learned is all of you locals, you all have the same story. "Oh, I was on Canyon Ferry, and this storm came out of nowhere, and the waves were this high, and we almost died." Like, all Helena people who've been on a boat, they've got this, like, almost died on Canyon Ferry story. Well, Galilee people had similar type stories. These storms, because of the geography we won't get into, would come in out of nowhere, and suddenly they call it a sea, but this lake would become very, very, very dangerous. And Jesus' very closest friends are on this boat, and he's sleeping, and the storm hits, and they're freaking out. And he finally wakes up, and he just goes like, "Chill." And the lake becomes placid, and the storm stops, and it's like, boom, everything's done. And on the one hand, that is so amazing to follow a Jesus who can do that. And on the other hand, it raises this question of, God, then why don't you transform my character more quickly? Because it's not for a lack of desire, it's not for a lack of intention, it's not for a lack of effort, but why then do things change so slowly? Why does transformation take so long? Speaking of transformation, some of you know several months ago I made this commitment that I was going to start doing 100 push-ups a day. Can you tell? I actually fell off that wagon several months ago, and I fell off because, like, I was doing it, and I was sore, and I thought that maybe I blew my rotator cuff in my left shoulder, and I couldn't sleep on that side. This is not an exaggeration. And then what happened was James brought this climbing wall pull-up thing. See, this is where the shirt thing comes in, because I go like this. It would be awkward for all of us if I don't. He brought this climbing wall pull-up thing in, you know, those ones that climbers use to make themselves get stronger, and he put it above his door, and I jumped on that thing once, and I think, if I recall correctly, I was able to do 2 pull-ups. And right, if you haven't done a pull-up since you're in 6th grade, remember, it works every body in your muscle, or every muscle in your body. Yeah. And I said, 2 pull-ups equals 100 push-ups. So I've been telling myself that I was going to get one of these things. And then James told me that one summer he went to this camp where there was one of these pull-up things in a doorway that he had to walk through a lot, and he made this decision that every time he walked through the doorway, he'd do pull-ups till he couldn't do anymore or something. And then he said he got home from camp, and his girlfriend saw him and went like, let's get married. Because he was so transformed. And I thought, well, my wife already can't keep her hands off me, but this couldn't hurt. 3 kids, right? I mean, anyway. So I'm like, okay, I'm getting a pull-up bar. So last Monday, wow, like, that's not distracting, is it? This last Monday I was on this run, and this is what happens with run, is you get the endorphins and you start getting ideas, and most of them are bad ideas, but nonetheless, that's what's fun about running if you're addicted to running, is you get ideas. And so I got this idea like, okay, I got to get a pull-up bar today, and Monday's my day off. And I had to go get Justice from preschool, and so I decided I'm picking him up from preschool, and I'm going to Target, and I'm buying a pull-up bar. And so I picked him up from preschool, and he gets in the van, and I said, dude, we got to run an errand because he wants to eat lunch. So you kind of got to warn him, like, we're not going to eat lunch for a little while. You're with me, little kids, people, right? Like, tell him what's coming. I said, we got to go get a pull-up bar. Or he said, where are we going? I said, to Target. He said, why? I said, I want to get a pull-up bar. Now, what I didn't consider is that to a 5-year-old, pull-up has a different association. Like, they're not thinking your muscle system, right? He said, why? I said, because I want to exercise with it. There was this pause, and then he said, well, it's best if they're not poopy. Transformation, though, right? Like, some of you, the thing that compelled you to start following Jesus years ago, maybe decades ago, was this promise from God. Some well-intentioned communicator or friend knew that you struggled with anger, knew that you struggled with anxiety, knew that you struggled with some kind of an addiction, knew that when you got on the internet, this happened to you all the time and it wasn't good. They knew that you had this issue, and they, as they were convincing you or talking to you about Jesus, you became convinced that if you would just follow Jesus, that addiction or that thing or that vice or that character flaw would just go away. And so you believed and you prayed, and you really believe that God was a God who, what he did to Bartimaeus' eyesight and what he did to the sea, he could do to your anger. And you prayed this prayer and you were convinced that you were healed, and then you left the prayer meeting and a car pulled out in front of you and you realized that you weren't healed, right? That it hadn't happened that quickly. And I think if you've been around Jesus for a while, it raises this really frustrating question of like, really, Lord? Do you really change people, or are the ones with good characters just the ones who grow up in good homes? I mean, can you really turn a miraculous corner with who people are and what makes their guts, what makes their character makeup? And some of you, you're new to considering Jesus. Maybe you're new to Jesus. And the reality is that this is part of the compelling piece. Because there's this thing, and you know it's wrecking your business, you know it's wrecking your marriage, you know it's wrecking your life, and you would love to just be freed. And I guess I feel like part of my responsibility is to go like, God can do that, and he's done it, but it's very much not the norm. He tends to go about things much more slowly. And the question is why? And that question of why is what started a series for us this last December that we called Prepared. And if you weren't with us in December, what we did in December is we just asked this question like, really, Lord? Do you really still transform people? Because for the cynic, they go, I don't see anything different about Christians other than what they do on Sunday morning. I mean, they say they're different, but they're not different at work. And for those of us that have been around church for a while, there's this sense of like, really, Lord? Because I've gone 2 steps forward and 1 step back and 3 steps forward and 4 steps back, and I kind of feel like I might be making progress. It just depends on what day. And so what we were asking in that series was, is authentic transformation really possible? Does God still change people? And the conclusion, or at least the suggestion I made during that series was that, and it comes from a guy named Dallas Willard that says, yes, it is. But there's this observation, and that is that Jesus, he organized his life around these practices, what the church has historically called these spiritual disciplines. And what we said is that authentic transformation really is possible if we arrange our lives around those practices that Jesus participated in to receive life and power from the Father. Now, the key there was saying, wait a minute. Reading your Bible, praying, memorizing Scripture, they're not wholly unto themselves. They're not a goal. They're not the end unto themselves. They're practices. Just like an athlete does things when no one else is watching. Did you watch the Baylor game last night? Kid hit 9 threes before he missed one. And the announcer said, growing up, he had this game he played with himself. He had to make 150 three-pointers before he left the gym. It's a practice. That shooting 150 three-pointers has no value in and of itself. There's only value in making a three-pointer if the game is actually being played. But it's this thing you do behind the scenes. Athletes do this. Musicians do this. There are things that they do when no one's watching, some of them unmentionable. That was supposed to be funny. No one's going to pay them to do that. But the reality is to perform when the game is happening, when the lights are on, requires that they do them. It's Mr. Miyagi, sand the floor, paint the fence, wax the car, right? It's practices. And so we talked about two. On Christmas Eve, we talked about this idea of solitude. We asked the question, what if Jesus won despite his busyness, not because he wasn't busy? What if Jesus understood the physiological, spiritual need for recovery in our routines? And then on Super Bowl Sunday, James talked about journaling. About the importance of articulating our thoughts and our words to God. And so this morning, next week, we're going to start a series that's going to lead us into Easter called Friday, Saturday, Sunday. This morning, we're just going to take 1 week and just talk about a discipline, because this is what we decide in December. Is a few times a year, we'll just kind of go like, here's one, and you might find it helpful. This morning, what I want to talk about is this idea of what you might call practicing the presence of God. Something that's both ancient and yet incredibly relevant. I was first introduced to the concept in reading a guy, this has probably been about a decade ago, and this is one of those practices for me that I've probably worked on as hard as any practice I ever have in my life, and yet have far from arrived on it. A guy named Brother Lawrence wrote a book. He was a monk, a Catholic, God-fearing guy who peeled potatoes and washed dishes. And Brother Lawrence journaled, and you can now read his journals in books. He had this experience where he said that it was a rare moment where he lost sight of the reality that God was with him. And that he lived in this kind of constant dialogue with God. And then another famous guy from this whole discipline is a guy named Frank Laubach, who is a French guy who saw the kingdom a lot like you see the kingdom, a lot like we see the kingdom. Like, he believed in Jesus, and he believed that Jesus came to transform culture. And in fact, Frank Laubach's movement is still one of the largest literacy movements in the world. So he met Jesus and became passionate about his kingdom and decided that Jesus would want every person in the world to learn how to read. And so he started these massive literacy programs, and he himself spent the bulk of his time doing that in Southeast Asia. And while there, you can read his journals as well, he started playing this game, and his game was, could no more than 20 minutes pass before he checked in with the Lord, before he just acknowledged his presence with him and had this conversation with him. I remember reading that at least a decade ago, and I decided that I wanted to play the game, and so I bought this book, or this watch, I'm sorry. Not this watch, a different watch. It must have been super annoying for my wife and everyone in my life, because I knew I needed a watch with like 70 alarm clocks on it. Because what I did is I set an alarm to go off every 20 minutes, and it worked until my watch got broke in the shower or something, and then it went away. So it's this idea of practicing the presence that I want us to focus in on a little bit. And I think one of the ultimate stories to step into as we consider this is the story of a guy named Joseph. Now, Joseph's a guy who shows up in Genesis chapter 37. He shows up at 17 years old. He's among the youngest of a very large family. And in the very first few verses of Genesis, we're told that he's kind of a tattletale, frankly, because what the text tells us is that his older brothers would often be sent out to the fields to tend the flocks, and his dad would send him out there to them. And then when he would return, Genesis 37:3 says he would always give bad reports about his brothers. So needless to say, his brothers weren't the biggest fans of his. Later, he also had this dream, and the dream involved his brothers bowing down to him, and that's kind of awkward if you're an older brother in that culture especially. And so they didn't like him all the more. And one day, his dad sent him out to the fields to check on his brothers, and his brothers went like, oh, lo and behold, look there's brother, there's a hole. Perfect. Let's marry those two things. And so they threw their brother in this hole, perhaps this well. And they didn't really know what they were going to do. They were just happy that their brother, at least temporarily, was in a hole. And they kind of split up. And eventually they decided, there's this caravan of slave traders. Let's sell him to the slave traders, and then he'll be gone forever. And in fact, they did. And then the older brother got back, and he's like, what happened to Joseph? And they're like, oh, he's a slave now. And he's freaking out, like, Dad's going to kill me. And so they framed that he'd been murdered or killed by wild animals. So Joseph arrives in Egypt. And in Egypt, he's sold into slavery. But watch what the text says, because I think this is so counterintuitive of the way we think about being in God's presence. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Now watch verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Now, could we agree that that's a little counterintuitive? Like when we think the Lord is with, it's like some egotistical wide receiver who just scored a touchdown, right? Like that's when God is with us. Well, like when we make a lot of money, when business is going well, when we just got married, when our dreams are being fulfilled, that's when we reference like, oh, God is with us. Not Joseph. He's just been sold into slavery and makes it a point to go, and God was with me. God was with him. So he's in Potiphar's house. And as some of you know, he's taking care of Potiphar's stuff, and he's doing a really good job, and he grows in his power and influence, and so Potiphar really trusts him, and Potiphar leaves town, and at some point Potiphar's wife makes some sexual advances on him, which I kind of think wasn't the first time, based upon the way she responded when he told her no, because she blew up, apparently doesn't hear no very often, especially from a slave, and so to save face, she framed it as a rape, or an attempted rape, and he was thrown in prison. And again, watch this. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Do you see the foreignness of this? And so Joseph, he's in this prison, and eventually he gets out of this prison because he interpreted a dream for Pharaoh that said, like, okay, there's going to be 7 years of really good times and 7 years of really bad times, and so if you steward the good times, then you'll be really wealthy during the bad times, and not only will your people still eat and your kingdom will stand, but when other people, like, they'll give you their whole fortune just for some food to eat. And so Pharaoh said, good idea, and he put him in charge. And eventually, during the famine, Joseph's brothers, they're hungry. And they show up, and as soon as Joseph sees them, he knows exactly who he's looking at, though they're unsure about who he is. But eventually all that's made known. And at the end of Joseph's story in Genesis 50, it says this, his brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Here's what I think is crazy. Joseph was convinced that God was with him, despite the fact that everything was going wrong. And some scholars would suggest that the only way to explain the life that Joseph lived, some would suggest the only way to make sense of his character would be to say that not only was God with him, but he was aware God was with him. Some would say Joseph is a giant piece of evidence that shows us what happens when someone lives in God's presence and is aware of his presence, which leads to this question. Like, what would you be capable of? What would happen in your life if you were absolutely certain God was with you? In sports, in business, in life, we use this phrase, that's a game changer. How might the abiding presence of God be a game changer in your life? I mean, what would be the value of practicing the presence of God? Because we're not into just talking about them because they're religious things and we can all feel good about ourselves if we do them. Like, who cares? Why does it matter? What would be the value of that? I mean, how would yesterday have looked different had you been living in God's presence? And I don't mean that in a bony finger in your chest kind of way. I mean that in a, like, courage that you otherwise didn't have kind of way. I mean that in a strength that wasn't in you kind of way. Like, how might your attitude, how might your decisions, how might your heart, so to speak, have been different yesterday had you known God was with you? See, there's this interesting thing in the text, and it starts as old as the text itself, as old as God's story. He seems to work really, really intentionally at communicating to people, hey, check this out. When you believe in me, like when you step into my grace, I'm with you. And it's this resounding gong in the text where God over and over and over tells people, I'm with you. I mean, we see it in Joseph. We also see it in a guy named Moses. Moses, one day, is walking through the desert. he happens upon a bush that's burning and not burning up, and he goes, that's weird. And he walks up to the bush, and it starts talking to him. And he goes, wow, this must be God talking to me. And sure enough, God begins to articulate to him that there's these people in Israel, or in Egypt, their name are the Israelites, and they are crying out from their oppression. For 400 plus years, they've been crying out to him, and he's saying, I'm going to go get them, and you're going to be my guy to do that. And Moses says, hello, like I just watched Back to the Future, hello, McFly, anybody home? Like, dude, did you miss what happened 40 years ago? Because 40 years ago, the text tells us Moses tried to do that very thing. He tried to rescue the people from Egypt, and he failed. And that's why he lives in the desert, because he had to get a new occupation and a new family, and he had to flee for his life. And he says to God, who am I? Which I think is the culmination of the whole interaction. I think it's a question Moses would not have asked 40 years ago. Because when you ask, who am I? What are you acknowledging? And what are you really asking for? I mean, you say to your spouse or your boss or a teacher or a friend or a coach, like, who am I? You're looking for reassurance, right? You're looking for this long list of, you're what we would call, you're begging for compliments. God's response to Moses was what? I'll be with you. In other words, Moses, it has nothing to do with you. This is my gig, not your gig. This isn't about your strength and your ability. It's about mine. And if you can just bear in mind that I'm with you, then when you walk into Pharaoh's palace, it won't be about the fact that you failed. It won't be about whether or not you can do it. It'll be about the fact that I am with you and I can. Remember Joshua? He says to, Joshua was Moses' replacement. Joshua was this guy who had proven himself faithful for a long time. He was one of the faithful spies, and eventually Moses dies, and Joshua takes over, and God says to Joshua, oh, hey, by the way, you got to lead these million or so people who are pretty fickle, kind of a pain in the butt. You got to lead them across the Jordan River. That'll be hard because it's kind of at flood stage, and then when you get there, there'll be all these tribal wars you've got to fight, so people are going to die, so go ahead and go. And he says to Joshua, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be discouraged. Do not be afraid. Why? Because you are Joshua. Because you do your push-ups. Because you have a pull-up bar. Because you are educated at the University of Israel. No, what does he say? For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Like Joshua, if you could just live in my presence. See, Joshua's knowing that he was present didn't make him any more present. The idea was, if you could live knowing that I'm present, that there will be courage and power that you otherwise don't have. Jesus steps into this same emphasis and says, guys, you just got to know that I'm with you. In John 14, Jesus has spent all this energy explaining to the guys, like, guys, I'm leaving. And then he says this, probably knowing that it would make a lot more sense later than it would at the time. If you love me, keep my commands. And I'll ask the Father, and he'll give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. The world cannot accept him because it neither sees him nor knows him, but you know him, for he lives with you and will be in you. I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. And then Jesus ends his time in the body right before he ascends post the resurrection, and he tells the guys, like, hey guys, bad news. They didn't like me. They killed me. But I won. And guess what? Now you get to go tell everybody about me. Like, if you're telling everybody about a guy who was just killed, like, how does that bode for you? This is what we'll look into on Easter. Like, it's a freaky deal. And he says, and surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. How would it change things for you if you're able to live in the knowledge that God was with you? I'll tell you one thing that it changes. It changes the very core of what it means to follow Jesus. Because what you're prone to, and what I know what I'm prone to, is a type of Christianity that Jesus never came to create. A type of Christianity that says, try hard, try harder. It's a carnal, flesh-driven, human effort Christianity. It's not the movement Jesus is trying to create. And when you step in and go, God, you are with me, it transfers from try to God, I can't, but you can. God, I can't, but your message is you can through me. God, I want to just lash out at this person right now. I can't, but you can. God, this is so freaky. I can't, but you can. Moses, God, there's no way I can lead these people. You're right, but I can. Joshua. Do you think Joshua was supposed to find courage within the fibers of his physical being? No. The courage was supposed to come from the fact that he remembered that God was with him. My favorite instance of this, it's actually a verse that I've had a lot of fun with in the last couple of months. It's in Psalm 16. Ironically, Jessica referenced it last week. It's from King David. He says this, I keep my eyes always on the Lord, with him at my right hand. So here we go. Does his keeping his eyes on the Lord make him any more present in his life? No. It's what happens when I am aware of what is already true. I keep my eyes always on the Lord, with him at my right hand. I will not be shaken. David's going I couldn't do this. God, I can't. I can't, but you can. Even the Apostle Paul deals with this. He says this, what actually took place is this. I tried keeping rules and working my head off to please God, and it didn't work. So I quit being a lawman so that I could be God's man. And then in 20, he says, I have been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body. Ooh, wow. Life I now live, I live in the body. Why can't I read? I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. What is Paul saying? I can't. But when I remember that you can and that it's you in me, then I can. What would happen? What would happen if we could live our lives in the awareness of God's presence? And where it really lands, doesn't it, is the how. Because I'm not the only one that's done something dorky like buy a watch and set 80 alarm clocks and think that if it went off every 20 minutes, my friends would not stop liking me, and that would be a long-term fix, right? There's tattoos, there's things you hang from your rearview mirror, there's coffee mugs, I'll follow Jesus at work if I drink out of this coffee mug because I'll always see the verse on it, right? I mean, we've all done these silly things with the best of intentions, and the reality is they don't translate long-term very frequently. Here's what's new to me. As I was wrestling with all of this, I bumped into this article from a guy named Dallas Willard. Now, some of you, he may or may not be familiar with Dallas Willard. What I love about Dallas Willard is he's not only one of the most thoughtful theologians in the world today, he's a professor at the University of Southern California. So he's a profound follower of Jesus, who is very much a kingdom guy. He teaches philosophy at one of the most prestigious universities in the country. His view on this is if you're going to practice the presence of God, he says there's something from a discipline standpoint, from the 150 three-pointers before I'm going to leave the gym standpoint, from the sand the floor standpoint. He said there's something that's actually more valuable than even a quiet time. And those of us that have been on church know that quiet time, solitude is kind of the big dog of the disciplines. He says, one man's opinion, you can take it or leave it, that the most valuable thing you can do is memorize Scripture. He says, memorizing verses, there is a corresponding relationship between your ability to abide in God's presence and your willingness to do the work of, memorizing a verse a week. And I'm not even going to spend much energy speculating why. But it's a challenge I have for you. I mean, how would things look different for you? How would they look different if you lived your life in the reality that God was with you? Not in a shaming way, not in a religious way, but what if you carried that knowledge and that interaction and that relationship into your life, into your work? How would it change things? And I guess the 2.0 challenge is, it seems that those that I trust the most would say, well, if you want to get there, it's memorize Scripture. Not because it makes you holier, not because it makes you look really good if you can quote verses all the time. You don't have to do any of that. It's a heart thing, which is why we've started every week we try to pull a verse from the message, and if you want our help to find verses, we're helping you do that. They put them on those little squares. Ushers usually have them. They're always on the heat registers. There's that method. I mean, there's lots of ways to find verses. It's just the challenge that I have for you. You think of Joseph. And I don't know, there's some historical debate about Joseph and where his story came from. Some would say that he was a real person who really lived this remarkable life, and having lived it, told the story orally, and that oral story eventually got captured and written down. And that's what I would believe. Others would say, well, Moses might have made the story up. That there's even a strong group of Jewish theologians that what they believe is that when Moses led the people out of Egypt, he got them into the desert, And, for 400 years they'd been told they were subhuman. And so I suppose not unlike a group of really underprivileged kids or something, like he was trying to impart to them the value that they have because they're human, because they're gods. They'd been told they were less than human. And in Moses' efforts to convince them that not only were they gods, that he had made them and that he had a plan for them, that's kind of where this was born out of, because he was trying to express to them, like, you're gods and he's going to do something amazing with you. Others would say that maybe the stories were made up much more recently. Now, at the risk of being misunderstood, I would be of the first. What struck me this week, though, is, ironically, it doesn't really matter which of those you subscribe to. Every one of them ultimately had the same message. I mean, Joseph apparently said, if people are going to believe that I really lived this life, there's only one way to explain it. And that's that I abided in God's presence, that I was constantly aware when I was being sold into slavery and getting thrown into jail that God was still with me. And if Moses made the story up, which I don't believe, but some do, and some who follow Jesus do, if Moses did, well, on this point, he apparently still believed the same thing. Like, if a guy is going to live that well, if he's going to respond to adversity that well, there's only one logical explanation. There's only one thing that people would buy. There's only one way to make that believable, and that would be if he abided with God, if he was aware that God was with him. And if some other guys made it up, the same would be true. That apparently there's this universal belief that if someone is going to live that well, not just during the good times, but when the door slams in your face and you hear the deadbolt turn over as it does, that the only way to endure that will be to know that God's with us and that I can't, but you can. So my challenge to you, Narrate, is go live in God's presence. Go do the silent practices that result in your living in the awareness that God sits in the meeting with you, that he experiences the marriage with you. Like, go live in his presence. And here's the deal. It's not likely that God will heal you miraculously like he did Bartimaeus. But what's encouraging about the lives of those in the Bible is not only that they're broken, but the way they did it was they lived in God's presence today. And if you can live in God's presence today, then you can have victory. You can have character transformation. And if tomorrow you'll do the same thing, then again, there will be transformation. And a great life, contrary to popular opinion, is not one where God just waves a wand over you and fixes you forever. It's the compilation of a bunch of individual days, a bunch of individual moments where we go, God, I can't. Who am I? Have I not commanded you? I'm with you. I'm with you always. So I challenge you. How would things change for you if you were aware that God is with you? Let me close this up in prayer. God, I'm thankful, frankly, that you make yourself available to us in that abiding sense. And as Jesus so appropriately predicted, like, it's hard to believe at times because we can't see you. God, you could have chose to done things with a distant God, kind of eye in the sky type of deal, and yet you've not. You've made this commitment to dwell with us. God, to be perfectly frank, we kind of think we live in a culture that's more stimulating than any culture ever before, and lots of things compete for our attention, and so it's really easy to look at Joshua and Moses and even the disciples and go, yeah, but they don't have phones beeping at them and computers and all this stuff going on. God, would you help us to get ancient in the present, to embrace this historical discipline of memorizing Scripture, ultimately, God, because we want to experience life with you. Not just theologically, not just intellectually, relationally, even spatially. We love you.